Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Pepis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Diego Mauricio Cortés, an Assistant Professor of Global Media at the University of Oregon School of Journalism and Communication. Professor Cortés's research intersects alternative and community media, Latin American Indigenous studies, religious studies, and popular culture. Through his multidisciplinary practice, he examines formations of contemporary Indigeneities in the Andes, transnational evangelicalism, American whiteness, and media representations of the war on drugs. Professor Cortés is currently working on a book manuscript that explores the repercussions of the rapid expansion of evangelicalism, non-denominational American Christianity and Pentecostalism, among Andean Indigenous communities in Colombia, Ecuador, and Bolivia. Prior to joining the UO faculty in fall of 2023, Professor Cortés was an assistant professor of communication studies at the University of Pittsburgh at Bradford. Welcome to the UO, Diego, and welcome to UO Today, and thanks so much for speaking with us today.
No, thank you very much for the invitation. This is great, and thank you for the generous presentation.
So tell us first about where you're from and how you came to be an academic.
Well, I'm Colombian. From Colombia, I consider Colombia my home, my home, not only my birthplace but my home. But I did my undergrad studies here, so I emigrated to the United States in 2000. My mom immigrated before me, and she was the one who opened the door for me. So when the immigration is complicated, and one of the things that I tried to do when I moved here was to continue to get involved with Colombian politics. So this motivated me pretty much to go to college to study sociology, and I did it on CUNY in Hunter College in New York City. And that experience took me to Indigenous affairs. The way in which that was quite interesting. I did a high school and my education before high school at Colombia. Mm-hmm. And at that time, I didn't have any idea that Indigenous people exist in Colombia. It wasn't part of the conversation there. So, and in 2008, it was this big manifestation in Colombia of indigenous people. So, and it was in the headlights of the news. Indigenous people, I mean, how they look like, what is this matter? And it was impressive. It was like almost 50,000 people walking in Bogota, which it was a huge disruption aesthetically, politically. And I said, this is pretty interesting. Mm-hmm. And I want to be involved in this, learn more about this, and in a way contribute, learn from them. And that's one of the pushes that took me to grad school.
So, okay, so you made clear what drew you to studying these indigenous communities, but you also do global media, and your dissertation was on community radio. Yeah. So how did you get there?
Yeah. Really interesting question. So for my master thesis, when I saw this indigenous protest in 2008, it was a lot of conversation on how the protest was represented on mass media. Mm-hmm. So, and then I started digging on those questions for my master's. Mm-hmm. And in my master's, I ended up writing about media representations on indigenous people and how the media misrepresent indigenous people, but how and why, mm-hmm. right? That's an important question there. And in that work, I ended up finding that indigenous people were kind of counteracting those representations by creating their own media. So he said, this is pretty interesting, what's going on here? And of course, I approached the case study with excitement and fascination. And the PhD work, through that initial exploration, took me to more critical views on the case, mm-hmm. but also in other media expressions that are not necessarily mainstream, but have affected indigenous people. So some of them are Catholic Development Radio, and in Colombia is one kind of which became really famous media project called Radio Sutatensa. Evangelical Media, so which later this took me to another place. Self-produced media, and actually it's I ended up like writing also about media, non-digital and non-electronic media, used by indigenous people to foster some sort of politicized subjecthood in their youth. And actually, this is some sort of self advertisement.
Sure, go ahead.
I just published an article. The title is the Politics of Indigeneity, Decolonizing Historical Memory and Education in Colombia. That happened 2 days ago. So I went through different to media through different lenses.
So tell us a little bit about the work that you did with these indigenous groups. What was that research like? What did it entail?
Yeah, I stay living in a Colombian Southwest for 3 years, almost 3 years. And I started exploring questions on media, right, and like self-produced media. And later on I get involved with this grassroots indigenous educational project called the Misak Universidad. And the Misak Universidad is this post high school institution. They don't have a license. They don't have a license yet from the state. But like what they do in this institution is to provide classes and do research on what they call traditional methods for research and for engagement. So I ended up teaching there, and I ended up like doing like almost a 2-year research project with 3 students from the university, with Rosa, Liliana, and John. And this is actually a product of that work. So we engage in methodologies, like one of them is participatory methodologies. Mapas parlantes. Mapas parlantes is this way in which in the 1970s, indigenous communities from the area, they start looking at the territory as a place for not use a land, productive land, but like a place for life. So, and then they start doing maps and having discussions with people to remember, to have exercises of memory. So, and this is pretty much about that like we were trying to do something similar years later, and yeah, I got involved in that, and through that work, I explored other topics that give me opportunity first to make friends with the people who I was working with, and also to learn about other situations, including the question of evangelicalism.
Yeah, so tell us how you came to that topic.
Well, it's the thing is, when I was researching there, I realized something that I didn't know before I was there. And I realized how important evangelicalism became for the community, for indigenous, for in general for the indigenous world. But one of the things that I found interesting is in the conversation about indigenous politics, that part of the conversation, this evangelical part, is not much addressed. No, it's in a way some taboo or some misunderstanding of what's going on. It's when I encounter the topic, it feels to me the question of evangelicalism, why some indigenous people became evangelicals, and in this specific community where I was living, almost 50% of the people claim at one point of their lives to be evangelical. So it's a quite an important and that's the other thing, it's not just religion, it become kind of a political mark. If you said I'm evangelical, that means you support some candidates, you support it's. And then I said, well, this is quite interesting. So it was a lot of tension, and that's the other thing that I learned through these processes, and probably is something that it sounds quite obvious, but at the moment I didn't know that, or I didn't realize that. Then we tend to categorize or to think on indigenous movements as this homogenic group, right? And inside, and I think the most important part of the conversation is to humanize those groups, to say, well, some people are evangelical, some people don't practice religion, some people, right? Some people like football, other people not. So, but anyways, the evangelical ethos, it was really important there. And then I started realizing that it wasn't something external. It was already part of the indigenous identity. And one of the things, like, I started paying more and more attention, because there are some studies on the evangelical indigenous people, but every time I approach that conversation, people talk to me about American evangelicals, American missionaries. They were there for not only for 1 year, 2 years, for 20, 25 years. And every time that I ask, okay, who were that people, where they came from, why, what was the religion? And they just, we don't know. So he said that this is important. I mean, this is kind of like some sort of colonial situation that these people go there, but like the people who are being interviewed, they don't know much about them. So, and this is my motivation for this project where I am now.
Help me to understand. So you have these American evangelical missionaries that go to the Andes, and they evangelicize these people. And this has been going on for a very long time.
Since the 1960s.
Okay.
In this area.
In this area.
Yeah.
So you're also saying, or correct me if I'm wrong, that in some sense, the indigenous people indigenize the evangelical movements. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I have two questions. The first is, what's the appeal for those Andean people in evangelicalism? What is it about that movement that appeals to them? And the second is, how are they transforming it?
Okay, so I think people go and get attracted to the movement because in a way, evangelicalism gives tools to navigate modern neoliberal economies, right? So, and one of the things like evangelicals push a lot is the forging of the individual, of modern individual who save money, who have this idea of individuality, which is a big disruption in the Andean world, I mean, which is like quite a collective societies. So, but no, they pursue the forging of the individual, like empowerment, entrepreneurship. And so, but this is also appealing for some people. It says that they feel behind because they are in these community situations where egalitarianism is really important, but I mean, I think equality in a way has been quite romanticized. We always think in equality and something productive, and in reality it is. But also, like, equality in this context means upright mobility is difficult. When someone start having more capital than others, communities develop techniques to put everyone at the same level. So people, but at the same time, you have media, you have these pushes for accumulation, and people said, evangelicals are giving us opportunities, highways, like chances to meet people who facilitate that embracement, the embracement with these modern economies. So I think that was one of the main pushes. And the other, in that case, another main push was the kind of like the way in which the Catholic Church was keeping indigenous people in this area. Or in general, but let's focus in this area in Colombia. And the Catholic Church was quite authoritarian. It was exploitative, and the evangelicals came with a liberation opportunities. So they said, let's move here, and we will have some better individual outcomes with these Americans.
So what you didn't say anything about was the religious component of evangelicalism. Yeah. So is that not a factor?
And I mean, I think it's of course a factor for American evangelicals. Yeah. Like these groups come from the fundamentalist movement, yep. Which the Bible readingship and the irenacy of the Bible is really important. For them that was quite important, but like many of these evangelical groups and evangelical missionaries, they encounter the moment where, people said, I'm converted, but they are really, like, they doubt if they truly have these ideas of God they promote. So I think is for the indigenous people, I mean, and then I think it is like this believing of Jesus Christ is quite different than what like the Americans expect, or people don't understand evangelicalism, even when they embrace it in the same terms. So I think they prioritize other things.
And that's this indigenizing
Yes, and the indigenizing point, something which is fascinating, is the embracement of the charismatic movement. Because, the Americans went there, and this happens not only in Colombia, you see this in Ecuador, in Bolivia. The Americans expect to foster this Christianity, which is white, super moralistic, which is quite oriented to saving, to not drinking, to all those things. But and then the ceremonies they have music, in a way, some indigenous people follow it and appreciate the help they provide, because they also offer medical services. And that was one of the ways in which they capture people to offering services. So, but many people, many indigenous people said, this religiosity is kind of too plain. So the charismatic movement gives them emotionality, gives them. And the other thing that gives the charismatic movement open the doors for leadership. And so, but at the end, the American, many American missionaries, they just transfer the power of their organizations to indigenous people. But because they saw, there's no point to be here. These people are going with the charismatics. And the charismatics were the ones who, because it's more, is closer to indigeneity. The charismatic Pentecostal movement resembles more that experience, that Andean and Amazonic experience.
So is your research down there field work, and you're interviewing these people, or?
For the book,
for the book.
Well, for this book project, what I'm doing, this book project tries to focus the pretty much what I'm trying to answer there is why these American evangelicals get attracted to these indigenous organizations, and why the intentions and the consequences. So pretty much my focus is more on the American evangelical side, which I think I'm feel really fascinated for this, because I think it's more people like myself who come from Latin America, from other places, should pay attention to social phenomena that happen to the United States. For many years, anthropology, actually the field of linguistics, have a lot of relationships with the missionary movement. The Summer Institute of Linguistics were like, they were one of the institutions that push for linguistic work. So for many years we have seen people from the global north going to Latin America. So it's important so I'm focusing more on those American evangelicals. So my methods are, well, I'm focusing in the case of Colombia, Ecuador, and Bolivia, through three different lenses. In Colombia, it's more about identity, like what we were talking. With Ecuador, it's more about this radio station called HCJB, the Voice of the Andes, so which is a case, is a super interesting case. That organization was founded by American fundamentalists in the 1931. In 1940, I mean, they start broadcasting with a 200 kilowatt transmitter in shortwave and so on and so forth, which gives them not much power, but like in 10 years later, they reach a global audiences, global transmissions, because they incorporate a 10,000 kilowatt. And the growth of that project was amazing. So my question is how the question of the indigenous question is related to that growth. And yes, but I mean, for that, I have been in Ecuador doing research and so on and so forth. I have done extensive research in Colombia as well. This summer I'm going to Bolivia. But I mean, I'm focusing more in the evangelicals, in the white American evangelical movement.
So tell me a little bit about the Voice of the Andes. Like, who are who's broadcasting? Are these indigenous people that are doing the broadcasting?
In part, I mean, like there are some, but like no, it's kind of like, okay, when you see the advertisement or like the first campaigns these American evangelicals did to collect the money for the radio station, the indigenous images were there in those campaigns. They did in the 1920s. They tried to establish the radio station first in Venezuela, in Colombia, and Panama, and Cuba, and that didn't work. For Ecuador happened because Ecuador has, well, I mean, the history of that is long, but they have this minority liberal government, and before have this opening for religious freedom, trying to contest the power of the Catholic Church in Ecuador. Anyways, so they went there. The way in which they start collecting money for this was showing American evangelicals images of indigenous people. But so my argument there is, the indigenous question was always on the stake there. But not necessarily, they weren't, I mean, they were broadcasting to the Soviet Union. In the 1940s, 1950s, one of the main interests was to reach the Soviet Union during the Cold War. They have other interests, but they knew the hedonism, right? Like the images, the ideas these American evangelicals had of indigenous people, about the savages, and something that I find pretty interesting, this idea of the jungle. And it was a place to conquest, and this radio station was amazing. So it was a really good money making for them, the indigenous image. However, in practice, they did amazing things for indigenous people. I mean, they built hospitals, they do things, but also they made a lot of money, and they support their project. The amazing, expensive, and expansion of this project through the use of the indigenous images.
Wow, that research is fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, like, and I'm sorry for it, like.
Yeah, no problem. No problem. It's great. So, you're a scholar of global media. So what is that? What's global media, and why is it important that it gets studied?
Yeah, well, before the 1970s, 1980s, it was this lack of discussion of media production in the global south, like what we know as the global south. There was a lot of discussion on the media produced in the United States and Europe, and this with the colonization of Africa. So people start seeing, oh, well, we need some more fluency on media production here. So it was the Macbeth report in the 1980s and all this. So pretty much international, or the field of international media or global media, it's to look at media production in the global south, right? Like trying to look at projects and media projects that have been done in the global south, different than the traditional market or the traditional media outlets. Like we always think when we think the media, well, we think about the New York Times, but we don't think on Palestine journalists in Gaza.
Or the Voice of the Andes.
Or the Voice of the Andes. Yeah, or the Voice of the Andes, which is a really particular case study, and actually is regarded in media studies. I think the case of is really surprising than like the whole history of radio, Christianity and conservative Christianity has been really crucial in the development of radio technologies, and it's been quite disregarded at the conversation.
So, what attracted you to the University of Oregon? You're a new faculty member. Why'd you come here?
Well, I mean, I think is this kind of thing. I didn't choose the University of Oregon. The University of Oregon chose me, but and I'm pretty lucky. I think it's just a matter of luck, a matter of like landing in this amazing place where it's a lot of opportunities to go to contribute to Latin American studies, to of course to media and journalism, and yeah, I'm just pretty lucky. I cannot like brag and say, you know, I choose the University of Oregon. I choose to be here. I was just lucky to land here, and yeah, pretty much that was a question of luck.
Yeah. So we've already talked about your scholarship, but you're also a teacher. So tell us about a course that you're teaching or that you've taught.
Well, I've been teaching this quarter a class that I am enjoying a lot, and I think students are enjoying it as well, is media and religion. And in that class, we embrace sociological theory and the history, mostly of the United States, but we also talk about France, now Israel, to challenge this secularization theory. Like pretty much claims that religion is, with the advancement of modernity, religion is stopped being important. So this is pretty much the emphasis of the class, and discussing how religion is becoming really important for politics. I mean, we can see this, like all this madness was happening in Gaza, and religion is part of this situation, right? So this is kind of like what's going on in the class, and it's been really fun.
Interesting. So we're almost at the end of our time. This will probably be my last question. So one of the facts about your biography is that you are a McNair Scholar, and we have a McNair Scholarship program here. Yeah. So tell us about that program and how it was important to you.
Yeah, and I think this is a really great opportunity for those who are interested on going for a PhD, to students like first generation college students or like low income students. McNair Scholar, the McNair Scholar program walk you through the process to applications, and that was kind of like it changed for me. It opens opportunities that I didn't thought they were possible. And again, I am a big promoter of the McNair Scholar program, because that was kind of like the program that opened for me so many doors that I wouldn't be here if it weren't for the McNair Scholarship.
So that's a great place for us to end. Thank you so much, Diego, for taking the time to speak with us. It's great to have you at the University of Oregon. Thanks for taking the time to speak with me today.
No, thank you very much for this opportunity, and well, and I hope to have another interview when I publish my book.
we'll make sure that happens. So I've been speaking with Diego Mauricio Cortés, an assistant professor of global media at the University of Oregon School of Journalism and Communication. Thanks so much for watching.